This is the Jedburgh podcast. I'm the host, Fran Racioppi. Each episode, I speak with transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, and those dedicated to winning, no matter the challenge. The Jedburgh podcast is founded in the lineage of the Special Operations Jedburgh teams of the past and is sponsored by Talent War Group, an executive search and talent advisory. Visit talentwargroup.com for more. A percentage of all proceeds is dedicated to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. Just wanted to take a couple of seconds before we hop into this episode and thank everyone for the support that they've given to the Jedburgh podcast since we launched. It was about a year ago where I came up with this idea and I contacted my partners at the Talent War Group and said, hey, I think we have an opportunity to create real impact in society, drive organizations, teams, individuals to the next level of leadership by telling impactful stories of tried and true leaders who've done that across so many different industries, whether it be athletics, entrepreneurism, business, whether they're founders, social activists, journalists, you name it, we want to tell their story and we want to tell the good, the bad, and we want our listeners to take something away that they can apply immediately to their organizations and put themselves on the drive to succeed. Well, we have done just that. I couldn't be more thankful to all of the guests that we've had, their openness, their willingness to share, providing their lessons to help us all grow. And also thank you to all of our listeners. Our listeners are why we do this. We want to make you, your organizations, your teams, your families, society better in any way that we can through every one of our stories. A special thank you too to our sponsors who make this all possible. We wouldn't be here without you. We look forward to your partnership in 2022. Thanks for everything. Up until today, we have focused on long-form podcasts. Our episodes have been anywhere from 55 minutes to upwards of an hour and a half, and we've dug deep on so many issues. But through those conversations, we've learned a tremendous amount about ourselves, our guests, the world, and now we're going to launch a new series starting this week called Jumping In with the Jedburgh podcast. This is going to be a short form series. We're going to put it up on YouTube. We're going to put it on Instagram TV. We're going to put it on our social media. We'll put all the links out there. So if you're not following us, check us out on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, wherever you get social media. You got to try to find us, connect with us, follow us. We'll be posting those episodes there. The first one's going to come out this week, and that's with Peter Chiarelli. If you remember, Peter Chiarelli was our second episode that we had, and we told his story about Jersey Mike's, how he founded it, how he grew it from a business that was a single sandwich shop on the Jersey Shore to now what has become over a $2 billion business. We're going to reconnect with Peter. We're going to talk about his support to multiple charities, where the business has gone over the last year since we last spoke to him in March, and then also talk about an important initiative that he has supporting our veterans through Wreaths Across America. This is going to be the first in the Jumping In series. Don't miss it. Follow us on YouTube. Follow us on all your social media. Stay tuned for 2022. We have so much left to go. We're going to be introducing some new partnerships. We're going to be showing up at some events. Our guests are great. Our listeners are awesome. Continue to spread the word. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow. Happy holidays to everybody. Thank you for all your support. This episode is brought to you by 18 Alpha Fitness. Achieving peak mental and physical performance requires training. 18 Alpha Fitness uses decades of special operations fitness experience to transform customers into the best possible version of themselves. Whether that's preparing for the rigors of special operations training, improving personal fitness, or confronting personal or professional life with a renewed sense of performance and focus, 18 Alpha Fitness has a plan. High-performance environments require detailed, focused, and all-inclusive workouts that challenge our body and mind while pushing us towards a goal. The key to successful completion is trust and respect between trainer and trainee. Their team of experts will monitor and develop your performance from every perspective. 18 Alpha Fitness is led by special operators who've been there. They train to win, and they train to conquer any challenge. Visit 18afitness.com for more. This episode is brought to you by Analytics. As business owners, we have a lot on our plate. Our days are consumed leading our organization, setting the vision, crafting the strategy, and empowering and inspiring people to be their best. To achieve our goals, we have to think big, but it's the little things that matter. The routine tasks of running a business that take time and energy. And if we don't get them right, we fail fast. Analytics takes these tasks off your plate. They provide a deep bench of solutions to handle the most complex challenges in finance and accounting, IT servicing, data management, AV, and even web design. These no-fail tasks keep our business running day in and day out. And let's face it, most of us are never going to be great accountants, bill processors, or even web developers. Focus your time on leading your organization and let analytics handle the rest. Visit analytics.com for more information. That's analytix.com. In every episode of the Jedburgh podcast, we speak about the importance of leadership. We define why leadership matters and how we become better leaders. We show that leaders exist at every level of our organization, no matter how big or how small. And we prove that character and potential are the most important criteria to building elite teams and individuals. Although our lessons can be applied to any organization, some organizations are so vast, so large, so dynamic that it's often impossible to comprehend the scale and complexity, making leadership all the more critical. I'm joined in this episode by retired 4-star General Peter Chiarelli. General Chiarelli served as the Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Army, an organization of over 1.1 million employees, and during his tenure, a budget of more than $240 billion. General Chiarelli is highlighted in the history books as one of our nation's most innovative leaders, always willing to challenge the way the Army operated and unlock the driving factors of why. His curiosity and his humility transitioned our Army from Vietnam through the Cold War and into the counterinsurgency and counterterrorism battles we fight today. General Chiarelli commanded 20,000 soldiers in the Iraqi capital of Baghdad in the early days of the war. He later led over 150,000 people across Iraq during one of the most complex and challenging times for our military. He served as a scholar at West Point, and he served as a senior military advisor to Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. Today, General Chiarelli continues his mission to support our troops as he pushes the medical industry to work together to treat traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress. He advocates for wearable technology and treatment, and he knows firsthand the effects of over decades of combat on our military members. We cover all this in our conversation, as well as the next battles we have as Americans both abroad and at home. An eternal optimist, General Chiarelli and I share a passion for driving others to be their best, no matter the challenge. General Chiarelli, welcome to the Jedburgh podcast.
It's great to be with you.
Challenging the status quo, asking hard questions, forcing others to think about how and why, most importantly, why they do things, are critical skills for leaders in any organization. This podcast is built on taking the 9 characteristics of elite performance: drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, curiosity, team ability, effective intelligence, and emotional strength, and then tying them into the stories of our guests. And again, these come from the 9 characteristics that are used by Special Operations Command. Whether you're a Green Beret, a Navy SEAL, an Army Ranger, doesn't matter. They weight them differently. And they use them to assess, select, and then train all of their talent. But what most people don't realize is that the best leaders not only exhibit these traits, but they draw them out in their teammates, in their peers, in their subordinates, and their superiors. You achieved the highest military rank possible and you commanded the U.S. Army. And I think about that for a second. I'm like, you commanded all of the Army, in addition to all of the units that you commanded as you were moving up through the ranks. You led hundreds of thousands of service members across all branches in Iraq at one of the most tumultuous times. You transitioned the military from a Vietnam relic to a Cold War superpower to a counterinsurgency force for good. But you did it by questioning everything, even when you knew you didn't like the answer. So I think about it in the terms of these 9 characteristics. I think about curiosity, pushing and challenging the status quo. And I also think about humility, because you were willing to accept that we may not always have the right answers. We have to adapt and change. When we do these podcasts, sometimes we tell the whole story of our guests. Sometimes we tell a little piece. Sometimes we only talk about an initiative they're working on. I only think it's fitting for you that we have to start at the beginning. Your career started in ROTC in Seattle. Mid-1970s, Vietnam had been going on for a couple of years, about mid towards the latter part of the war. You entered the Army willingly, which was really not a popular choice amongst your peers, especially in the liberal Northwest. ROTC meetings were held in secret. You couldn't wear your uniform in public, but your father served in World War II as a tanker. You, like me, are Italian descent. And your father, like my father, said, yes, I support you going into the Army, but you're going to go to college first and you're going to go in as an officer. I would say that today, and probably because of you, we support our military. It's so much different than the times were back then. In fact, we revere and we respect the soldiers and the service members, even if we don't agree with the politics and the policies. What was it like in that time time period, entering the Army. You're a young officer. It's the formative years, if I think about my time as a second and first lieutenant, that shape you in so many ways for the rest of your career. But your dream was to become a lawyer, but you end up going into the Army during this time. So talk to me a little bit about what that was like.
Well, it was a difficult time. I remember going to my father when I was just about ready to graduate from high school and say, hey, Dad, I'm going to go see a recruiter and join the Army. I feel that I need to go serve my country. Remember, I grew up in a town at that time. Seattle wasn't as liberal as it is today. It had 3 or 4 different bases scattered around town: Navy, Naval Air, Army. It was a kind of a military town, and I grew up around World War II vets. And when I went to my dad and told him that, he understood, but he looked at me and he got about as cross as he ever got with me at any time and said, no, you're not. No one from this family has ever gone to college. You're going to go to college. If you want to join the Army, get into an ROTC program and then go through ROTC and enter that way. I wasn't used to saying, Dad, you're wrong. He was my hero. I listened, and that's exactly what I did. But I remember it was difficult. Our ROTC, we got a call at 5:30 in the morning, and we're told one of 3 different places to show up for drill. Drill would last for exactly an hour, and we'd be out of there before the protesters could catch up with us. And you're right, we didn't wear uniforms. And when the first lottery was held toward the end of the Vietnam War, I prayed that I would get a low number so that I could rationalize to my friends why I joined ROTC. And lo and behold, I got 276. I would not have had to enter the Army under the lottery if it had ever been implemented. But those kinds of things that you did, because it was not a popular profession at that particular point in time.
But you go in and you spend your kind of initial first 4-year commitment, and then you actually submit your resignation papers to get out. How come?
My wife grew up in Portland, Oregon. I grew up in Seattle, Washington. I grew up in the same neighborhood. I lived in a house for a couple of years when I was a young kid, but I don't remember it. I remember living in a single house, going to Magnolia Grade School, which I walked to just a little bit over a mile, Catherine Blaine Junior High, and Queen Anne High School. And I envisioned the same kind of life for my kids, and so did my wife. We had our first child. We could not imagine that we would enter into a profession that would see us moving every couple of years all around the country and, quite frankly, the world. I really wanted to go to graduate school. I had something to prove to myself. When I did not get into law school, one of life's great lessons, I could not get in because I had a low SAT score. I felt that I could do important things, and I wanted to prove to myself that I could go to school and get better grades than I had as an undergraduate. The job opportunity gave me a chance to go to school, and it wasn't until the Army countered with an opportunity to go to 2 years fully funded graduate school, on to West Point to teach. I hardly even knew where West Point was growing up in the Pacific Northwest. It was too good a deal. We decided that if we didn't like it, we didn't like moving, we would go ahead and after our West Point commitment was finished. But that never happened. I came in for 4 and it ended up being 40. So almost 40.
In business, that's a good return on investment, by the way.
They had all the hooks in me. They said all the right things at the right time and offered the right things.
Well, that's what they do. If you think about your whole career, I mean, as you're talking about, I think about mine, and it's like, okay, so you're a lieutenant, and then everybody comes to that decision. I think every lieutenant has that conversation, and they're like, I can go now. It's like, I can go to the FBI, I can go to the agency, I can go somewhere else. I even remember I was in Iraq as a first lieutenant in 2005, 2006, and I was like, man, my dad had talked to me about the Coast Guard. That's a good job. And I'm sitting in my little chew in my hut in my room. We're getting rocketed, and I'm thinking, if I was a Coast Guard pilot, like I could live on the water, I could fly helicopters. How do you branch transfer? And I remember I actually looked it up, and I had a call with a recruiter from the Coast Guard, and he had told me that they had filled their cross branch quota for like 10 years. And I thought I had this revolutionary idea, but then they do. They come back and they're like, okay, well, if you stay in, here's what you're going to get. You're going to go do these jobs. Even though in the back of your mind, it's like, that's like kind of a real big hopefully if I actually get to do those things. And then you look at getting out, it's like, oh no, I'm going to go try to do those things. And you end up staying in time and time again.
I remember getting a call from a branch manager one time that said, listen, I'm going to tell you something now, and you should go call your mother and tell her what a great job you're doing in the Army. You've been hand-selected to go to Korea on an unaccompanied tour for 1 year. That does not happen to too many folks, and you're one of them. Call your mom right now and tell her. When I became vice chief of staff, I had an opportunity to work with some of these personnel guys. I said, do you guys really use that tactic? Was that as nefarious as I think it was in hindsight? And they said, yeah, that's what we have to do, and we got a tough billet to fill. Call your mother.
1 year on the DMZ, all expenses paid.
Yeah, away from your family.
You stay in, you went to West Point, and you have an opportunity to join the Department of Social Sciences. Now, I'm not a West Point guy. You're not a West Point guy. I actually didn't even know there was such thing as this Department of Social Sciences. And then I read about it, and I read that General Petraeus went there. You went there. So many of our nation's greatest leaders have been in this department. Can you talk a bit about that teaching experience, and why does this department breed this level of leader that has gone on to command at the most senior level? And I know there's so many more that have served in there.
Yeah, it just does a fantastic job of sending people to graduate school all over the country. If you want to go to Princeton, you can go to Princeton. If you want to go to Harvard. I had not been allowed to go to the University of Washington because my mother said it was too big. I went to a small liberal arts Jesuit university called Seattle University. All I wanted to do was go to the University of Washington and prove my worth. So it takes folks from all over, gives them a 2-year fully funded graduate degree, and then it has great leaders. And Jim Golden was one of those leaders I knew while I was at West Point, who went on to become a brigadier general and had an illustrious career at William and Mary. The head of the department was a guy named Don Olvey, who was just an amazing man with an amazing family. And he gave us all the opportunities to take the 2-year fully funded education that we'd had and explore things we wanted to explore. And when you bring together a bunch of bright minds, I wasn't necessarily the brightest mind back there, but I worked harder than anybody else. When you bring them all back together, you get a copy of the New York Times every day. You do things like caption contests where you post something on a bulletin board and have an opportunity to talk with folks that have been educated all over the country. It breeds the kind of leadership cauldron we had in the Department of Social Science. I learned so much when I was back there from so many different people, including Dave Petraeus, Doug Lute, a guy named Pat Pudignano who left us far too soon. It was just an amazing opportunity.
And you were there at such an interesting time, too, because we're coming out, Vietnam's over, but now there's the after-action review time, right? You know, all the lessons learned. What do we have to accept? What went wrong? What went right? How are we going to move forward? But then there's also, and I want to ask you about General Colin Powell, but now there's this emerging theme in the Army, the transition into the Cold War, what eventually became known as the Powell Doctrine of, if we're going to get into conflict, we're going all in. This morning, actually, I busted in the house because I was running late to get back here after dropping my son off. And my wife said, whoa, hey, Stormin' Norman. I looked at her and I said, Stormin' Norman. I said, that's really fitting today because I'm talking to General Chiarelli, who probably knew General Schwarzkopf. And she said, I don't know what that means. And I'm like, Stormin' Norman, that's the nickname they gave to Norman Schwarzkopf in the Persian Gulf War, because he, like General Powell, was all about force. When you go in, use force. And so you're there at this time where the Army has to start to think about, what does this transition look like?
It was a really difficult time. My first 4 years in the military were a real difficult time. You know, we had all the issues that you've read about and heard about, race relations issues, drug issues. We were trying to institute a professional Army and move to an all-volunteer force. That was a difficult time. And to come back to West Point during that time and talk with other folks that had similar experiences. I mean, literally, the Department of Social Sciences reached out and grabbed the best and the brightest, but I was grabbed because of a cheating scandal that had occurred at West Point in 76 or 77. And there was this commission set up run by Frank Borman, who was one of the early astronauts. And he said, hey, listen, West Point is too inbred. And that really gave me my opportunity because they hadn't invited a lot of ROTC folks and OCS folks to come back to West Point to teach. Normally you went through school, the department that you were the best in kind of, made a little note that, 3 or 4 years into this, we might ask this kid if he wants to come back, this young lieutenant, and teach here and give him the same opportunity I had. I was asked to come back because the Foreman Commission said what it said. You need to reach out and grab just not West Point graduates. You need to grab other folks who have done well in the Army. And that's exactly what happened to me. And if it hadn't been for a mentor of mine named Ron Adams, who later became a lieutenant general, I would not have had that opportunity. When I went into him and said, I'm going to leave the service after 4 years, I've accepted a job in Portland, Oregon. He said, come back in 2 hours, and gave me this offer. It would not have happened. The biggest lesson, though, that I learned at West Point was that the Department of Social Sciences was really kind of a team. It was all about team building. We had so many things that were on our plate that were extracurricular activities that had to be done, conferences that had to be held, and other things, plus the opportunity to write. And that's what kept me there for a fourth year, was an opportunity to work with some colleagues and publish a book. It really taught me a lot about teamwork, which became kind of the centerpiece of my Army career moving forward. The ability of a team to do things that no single individual could do on its own. It wasn't about individual leadership as much as it was, how do you bring together a whole bunch of really smart folks, and somebody has got to lead in different instances. How do you do that and get everybody to contribute and get the most out of them? And to me, that was the big lesson I had coming out of West Point.
Well, this diversity of thought that you're talking about is so important in building organizations. When we had General McChrystal on in November, we spoke a lot about this, where we think about diversity so many times in all sorts of organizations, and we think, well, I have to get people of different ethnic backgrounds. They have to be of different color. I need men. I need women. But the reality is, if you can do that, but if everybody went to Harvard or everybody went to West Point, they may look different. They may have had some different experiences in life, but they're still thinking the same. So now, how do you challenge that? Because the greatest organizations, the greatest teams focus on diversity of thought in the organization so that we're driving not only collaboration, but there's a level of dissension and a little bit of that constructive argument that happens.
For sure. And that's what we saw every single day in the Department of Social Sciences during the 4 years I was there. And I took those lessons learned from my first assignment in Europe, the power of the team and how to build a team and bring together people to do something that maybe no one has ever done before.
Well, I think you did do that, actually. You brought out, you did do that when you went to Europe, though, in winning the gunnery challenge.
Yeah, the Canadian Army Trophy. Taking the lessons learned I learned at West Point and pulling together and putting together a team to do something in the United States Army that had never been done before. It was a direct product of that experience at West Point. We built a team, and we did everything we could to ensure that team was successful. And that meant listening to your soldier and being willing to change course when you listen to something that made a heck of a lot of sense that you may have not realized was really impactful. I remember at one particular instance, we were limited to the number of rounds we could fire in the train-up, which was a 14-month train-up for this big gunnery competition. We had, if I remember right, 120 rounds.
That's like nothing.
It was not very many. And at the same time, this was the revolution in training that was occurring with gunnery trainers that were coming on board. There was one for the Armor Force and the infantry, Mounted Infantry Force, called the UCOF, the Unit Conduct of Fire Trainer. It was brand new.
I remember it from 4th ID.
It would seem medieval if you were to compare it to what you can get on your phone today, but it was a huge deal. Everything in it was exactly like sitting in a tank. The switches were where all they were supposed to be. You worked what we called switchology. You did all those things. You had somebody who was looking over your shoulder, and you fired different scenarios. And what we used to do is when somebody missed a particular engagement with a live round is we'd pull them off the range, stick them in a UCOF, and see if we repeat that engagement a whole bunch of times, then step them back on the tank and see if they couldn't, hit the moving target at 1,500 meters while on the move. And we did get really good results. And I had one kid come up to me and he said, "Sir, you know why you're not getting good results is that when you move from the tank into the UCOF, you're moving from something that's hydraulic controlled to something that's electrical controlled. the instruments work differently. My Cadillac works differently in moving that gun tube around. I think it would be really, really helpful if we went into the UCOFT. I think that's a really good thing. But after we get out of the UCOFT, which is electrically powered, go onto a tank and do a simple thing called a snake board, where you get on and you take those Cadillacs and you traverse that gun around looking through the sight, you traverse it on a board. He said, I think we'll do much better because it'll get us used to the hydraulic controls after being with the electrical controls. We did it. It worked. That was a PFC's idea. That wasn't a major's idea. And it was listening to your soldiers.
See, that's so important in leadership, I think, because when I talk to a lot of folks in the private sector, in the civilian sector, and I speak about my time in the military, they often will think that you just sit around and you wait to be told what to do, right? Or there's this hierarchy of command, and the commanders come in and they sit around, they say, do this in this way, and you just have to execute. But what I always tell them is that actually the military, for as much as the hierarchy exists, and there are those days where you're sitting, what we would call waiting on the word, usually to go home, more often than not, it's that bottom-up feedback that leads to innovation. Because at the top, at the commander, when you're in charge, when you're the CEO or you're a director in a company, you don't always know better. You don't always know all the information that has to go into making the best decisions. And when you can sit back and take that bottom-up feedback, your ability to innovate and move much further, much faster is so much more enhanced.
I couldn't agree more. That's exactly, to me, the essence of team building. Really, it's the ability to listen, to not be in the transmit mode all the time. It is so true. It's almost trite to say, you never learn anything when you're talking. There comes a point in time when you have to make a decision. And if I move that forward to the work that I did in traumatic brain injury when I was vice chief of staff, that was the same kind of thing. I had no idea what traumatic brain injury was. I knew what my football coach had taught me when I got bounced on the head, shake it off and get back in the game. I had no idea what post-traumatic stress was. And when faced with these huge problems that were facing the Army, when I became vice in 2008, given the numbers that we had, I applied the same lessons learned at West Point when we were training for the Canadian Army Trophy to understanding something that I just did not understand, nor did too many other people.
You become the 32nd vice chief of staff of the Army. It's the second highest position in the U.S. Army. Second time that you worked for General George Casey. You were under him in Iraq as well. You held this position for 3.5 years. I think about this, and this is the pinnacle of every Army officer. Every Army officer looks at this and says, I can't wait to get there. And it's so difficult, I think, for people also to rationalize the scope of that. I said a little bit about it in the intro, but I was looking at your LinkedIn. I chuckled a little bit when I read the description when you have your role. And I'm going to read it because it says the COO of an organization of 1.1 million men and women with a yearly budget of $240 billion. And you look at it on LinkedIn, and you're like, oh, okay. And it's like, wait a minute, 1.1 million people with a yearly budget of $240 billion. This is one of the largest and most complex organizations in the entire world.
I have to say that budget was inflated at the time. And the reason why it was inflated is because of what we call OCO money. The Army had a whole bunch of extra money it was given to support the other services in the two wars that we were in. So I had about $100 billion added to my base budget of $140 billion, but it was $240 billion. And that in itself created a whole bunch of issues. It was a huge job. Normally you only come into that job for about a year and they move you out to do something else. But they decided they were going to have to leave me longer till I finally got a few things right. And it ended up being just over 3.5 years.
Well, the biggest pillars that I would say the pillars are the things you focused on during your time as the vice chief was first on the military healthcare system. And then secondly, on the development of the next generation of Army leader. But when we look at the military healthcare system, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan they injected into the military healthcare system so many different types of injuries, combat-related and non-combat-related injuries, that I think we were so, in a way, unprepared for institutionally. I think from a medical standpoint, certainly the military in many ways leads some innovation in medical field, but from and in trauma and point of impact trauma, But when it comes to actually how do you treat these people in long-term care, systemically over time, it seemed like we were still resting so much on the Vietnam era or the Vietnam thought process. The VA was still so many decades behind the civilian healthcare system. When we first spoke, you told me that during that time, 32% of those classified as wounded suffered from TBI, or traumatic brain injury, or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. 62% of the most seriously wounded people were in that 32%. But yet, as you said, in 2008, 2009, we all knew actually almost nothing about TBI or the long-term effects of PTSD. What at that time did we know? And when you assumed the position of the vice chair, how did you assess this situation and then say, yes, this is what we have to focus on and this is where we have to go?
We didn't know a heck of a lot. I often look at criticism that the NFL has had that you should have known the impact of football and some of the traumatic brain injury that is suffered there. You should have known this. Frankly, we did not know it. Like I said before, only knew what my football coach had told me about a concussion. Shake it off, get back in the game, you'll be fine. And I literally had senior medical officers tell me when I asked a question about concussion, what are the long-term impacts of concussion, look at me and say, hey, listen, I grew up playing rugby. I've had 6 concussions before I entered the Army, and I'm one of the most successful surgeons in the United States Army today. You don't have to worry about concussions. People recover from concussions, and there is no long-lasting impact. Well, nothing could become further from the truth for some people. We are all genetically different, and these things affect us in different ways. And I don't need to repeat to you the different diseases that run in families based on their genetic makeup. And the fact of the matter is the same for concussion. And I couldn't get the answers that I needed listening to my doctors in the Army. I had to reach out to civilian doctors, which proved to be the people I needed to listen to. And it wasn't just me. My counterpart, Jim Amos, who at that time was the vice in the assistant commandant of the Marine Corps, he had seen the same issue with Marines. And the two of us went on a journey to try to learn everything we possibly could, which caused us to have to listen to a whole bunch of different people and finally make some decisions on where we were going to go. Now, people don't normally like to question doctors. They're always seen as the smartest person in the room. And when they say it, and they say it with authority, the tendency is to say, well, that must be the case, because that's what the doctor said. When we looked into it, we found out that there were folks who weren't necessarily in our sphere of influence, that were outside of the Army, who could really help us with this problem that we were seeing. But you're right, the numbers were huge. And I had expected to see those that lost arms and legs and had been wounded to be the biggest group that had a VA disability, a single VA disability of 30% or greater. It wasn't even close. They were running at 11%. When I, in 2008, combined traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress, it was 32%. And when I left, in 3.5 years later, it was 64%. 64%.
And there's a big spectrum, though, too, when you talk about PTSD specifically. I mean, there's this stigma that lives around this where people think, oh, if you have PTSD, you see dead people and you have all these visions and you can't function and you sit there in your chair and convulse. And that's not true. For some people, it is. But those cases are rare and they're extremely sad and they're extremely debilitating for the people who suffer from that. But is a stigma around that. It's not the reality for the majority of those that suffer from it. But I'm interested in this because to combat this stigma, you actually started dropping the word disorder from PTSD and you started calling it an injury. This train of thought was not actually immediately picked up by the medical industry, the civilian medical industry. They continue to call it a disorder. But you said, quote, you don't want to be labeled with having a disorder. We consider it honorable for people to get help with the visible wounds of war. Why wouldn't we consider it honorable to get help with the invisible wounds of war? I think that's a profound statement.
You said so much there that I want to unpack. First, this word stigma is absolutely critical. You say we had never been faced with these problems before. We'd always been faced with these problems before. And if you look back into Greek mythology, you can see instances where people talked about post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury without really calling it that. But these were problems that came with war. We swept these things underneath the carpet, and the reason why we did is because of the stigma associated with them. And if there's anything that Jim Amos and I were able to do, it was to make it okay to talk about traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress. The thing that gave me the ability to do that was a great doctor at UCLA named David Hovda. And he brought to me a single slide. And this slide proved pivotal with me telling a story to units before they deployed. And it showed 3 brains. The 3 brains all were pictures of brains that were taken using something called positron emission tomography. And all it was a new way of doing, for lack of a better term, taking a picture of the brain where you pump sugar into the body and saw the brain light up. The brain is a small organ, but it burns 20% of the energy created by the body. Most people don't understand that. And when it's functioning the way it's supposed to function, using positron emission tomography and taking a picture of the brain, what you see is all reds and yellows. The 3 pictures were, 1, a normal brain that looked all red and yellow, and then 2 other brains. They looked almost the same. One was an individual who had been in a car accident and had been comatose for 5 days. They pumped him full of sugar, took a picture using positron emission tomography, okay? That picture looked exactly the same as the middle picture, which was of a UCLA football player injured with 1 minute and 12 seconds to go in the first half, cleared at halftime to play the second half, played the second half, but the trainer came up to him and said, listen, you took a big hit to the head, and sometimes concussions don't produce symptoms for up to 24 hours. If you have any of the following symptoms, I want you to go see the doctor first thing tomorrow. He woke up, had the symptoms, went in and told the doctor what the problem was. They took a picture of his brain using positron emission tomography, and I challenge anyone to tell me the difference between the brain of the individual who had been comatose for 5 days as opposed to the brain of a football player who walked in 24 hours after the event, said to his doc, hey, doc, this is what I'm feeling right now, and I was told to come see you in the event that I had these symptoms. It was stigma. It was trying to combat stigma. And when I had that slide, I could prove to a young kid, you know what? What your football coach told you wasn't necessarily the case. When you get smacked on the head, it's not necessarily always something you can just shake off and get back in the game. You need to go seek the appropriate help, talk to somebody, and let's see what we can do about it.
Well, yeah, because Pete, these injuries affect, it's not just service members. I mean, we spoke on a previous episode with the NFL wide receiver, Austin Colley. And Austin Colley was the poster child actually in the NFL for traumatic brain injury and potentially the onset of CTE, which comes later. But he had a series of devastating hits. And this was a phenomenal athlete who had been knocked out, spent a couple of games on the sidelines, came back in, played like 2 plays, got knocked out again. And then this happened multiple times. And someone who was in the Hall of Fame at BYU, recruited to play for the Colts, then went to the Patriots, now had a career that ended up only being a couple of years because of the hits that he took.
And that's what happens to some folks. What David Hovda taught me is you could take a young lady who wears 120 pounds and put her next to an NFL offensive lineman who comes in at 300, hit him with the same force to the head, and where the lineman, because of his genetic makeup and the way his brain processed that hit, is out for the count, whereas the young lady at 120 pounds who had that same hit is perfectly fine. We don't know everything we need to know about traumatic brain injury, nor do we know what we know about post-traumatic stress. But you tell the story about me dropping the D. That was because of a family member who came to me and said, listen, My husband, I know, suffers from post-traumatic stress, but he won't go see a doctor because he does not want to be branded with having a disorder. He said, why do we call it post-traumatic stress disorder? And when you look back, what you find is before we got into the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, most of the research that was done on post-traumatic stress was done on women who had been sexually assaulted. It just struck me as she told me this story, and I realized the history of post-traumatic stress and the stigma that surrounded it. How could you go up to a woman who's been violently sexually assaulted, who has issues with relationships with men after that incident, and say she has a disorder because of that? And I made that argument to the American Psychiatric Association. Almost immediately after I retired, they were getting ready to publish what they call a DSM, their new DSM, which is their Bible. I won't go into that. I went to them and begged them. I said, please, drop the D. You don't have to call it an injury. Just say post-traumatic stress. Get rid of the D. I'm trying to give you business because there are people out there that are suffering from this who are not coming to see you to get the help that they need because a 19, 20, 21, 22, 27-year-old male or female doesn't want to be branded with having a disorder. Get rid of it. We will help get at the stigma issue revolving around post-traumatic stress.
When you frame it that way, in that context with those types of, call them victims, I mean, for sure they are, it's almost unfair if you think about the word disorder, to say that they have a disorder because this happened to them.
What's really unfair about it, what little we know about it, yet we call it a disorder. Why would you brand it that way right out of the box when you don't understand it? And that's probably human nature. If we don't understand it, we decide we're going to call it a disorder. When in reality, I don't believe it's a disorder at all. I believe something biologically happens to the body in some people, okay? And it happens to a different degree. There's this other tendency to say that PTS is PTS. It's not. It comes in different degrees. That's why some people can get tremendous relief from their post-traumatic stress by doing different activities. They're maybe outdoors, maybe mountain climbing, whatever it might be that helps them. But there are other cases of post-traumatic stress that run much more seriously where those things may provide some immediate relief, but they don't provide the long-term relief the individual needs. That's the person that I'm focused on right now, trying to find that individual the relief that they need through new treatments, possibly new drugs or other things that can help them get the relief they need from what can be a disease that not only affects the individual, it affects the whole family. And that's an important point you bring up, is it affects the entire family.
Well, the long-term effects so many times of PTSD and TBI and these injuries that you suffer come in forms of sleep disorder, where you may experience nightmares, you may experience higher levels of anxiety, emotional frustration. And because of that, now you're not sleeping. We've had several conversations on different episodes about the importance of sleep. We talked to Dr. Chris Free, who I know you've spoken with, about operator syndrome, where we push ourselves for so long, for so many years on end. We're always focused on the mission, but we don't take care of our nutrition, our sleep, our mindfulness. So how do we get that back? We spoke with Special Operations Association of America, where they're advocating the Hill on policy on mental health. But then we've also talked about wearables. We've spoke with Kristen Holmes of Whoop, VP of Performance Science, where Whoop is tracking so much of your vital information. It's actually telling you through an analysis of your rest what your workload can be the next day. And then recently we spoke with Richard Hanbury, the CEO and the founder of Sauna Health, which is a wearable that's training your brain pathways through the use of light and sound. And it's training your neural pathways to understand pain and then mitigate pain, which is allowing victims of nerve damage to actually sleep better. Because what they found is that when you have systemic nerve damage, that these elevated levels of anxiety that you have don't allow you to sleep, but then that leads to depression, that leads to anxiety. Eventually it could lead to suicide or suicidal ideations. You're doing some work right now with wearables and sleep disorder. Could you speak a little bit more about, your involvement in that and the importance of sleep as a secondary effect to PTS.
When I was Vice Chief of Staff, besides working to understand and look for therapies for traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress, I was also asked to look at the Army's suicide rate and do everything I could to try to bring it down. We had gone from, in 2001, 10 suicides per 100,000 soldiers for a demographically corrected population, remembering the Army is basically a young organization. When I got out, I lowered the average age by at least 3 years. We see more suicides in the younger population. So what the CDC used to do is they used to demographically correct the population for us so we could see how we were doing. In 2001, we were about one half our civilian counterparts. By 2008, we had caught up. We had doubled our suicide rate. We were at 20 per 100,000, which was just a little bit higher, quite frankly, than that demographically corrected population. And I was asked to look at that. And what I heard is I had suicide cases briefed to me. Many of these individuals, we were able to go out and do an investigation, look at medical records, suffered from nightmares. They would have nightmares. And the reason why we knew that is because spouses would say that he had, terrible nightmares. So in order to avoid those nightmares, what do? You drink yourself into a stupor, you pass out, you get a form of sleep. The nightmares don't happen. And quite frankly, which created another issue because the VA wouldn't at one time treat anybody who had an alcohol disorder or was abusing alcohol for post-traumatic stress until they got off the alcohol, which then they were using alcohol to medicate themselves to help them with the symptoms of post-traumatic stress. I knew that nightmares were a problem. And when a young entrepreneur who had talked to a young soldier who had put together a program, an app for his dad's Apple Watch that made use of the haptic function on the back of the Apple Watch. And it's not just an Apple Watch. You could do this with any watch. The company that I'm working with is called Nightwear, and they use an Apple Watch. It's a specially provisioned Apple Watch that collects data like I can do right now by looking at my watch and see what my heart rate is while you're sleeping, sends it to the cloud, runs it through an algorithm, and after collecting data for about 3 days, it knows, based on these different things it's collecting off your wrist, when you're going into a nightmare. Rather than wake you up, it provides a haptic shock, so to speak, to the wrist that just breaks up that what's happening enough, not to wake you up, but to pull you out of the nightmare. It doesn't work for everybody, but it works for a large portion of folks that suffer from these serious nightmares. And what I like about it is two things in particular. Number one, it's FDA cleared. The FDA has looked at it. They believe the data supports their clearance of it to be used. Number two, it's not invasive. It's not a pill. It's not something you're taking that is a off-label prescription, a drug that was brought to market to solve another problem that in some people solves a different problem. So the doctor goes ahead and provides what's called an off-label prescription. It's not another pill somebody has to ingest. Don't take anything that I have said as saying that nightwear is the answer to suicide. It is not. It is one contributor to helping to control some of the symptoms that I saw in my study of suicide are the ones that seem to be present at times in some people where it could provide help. And it also provides help for people. We all function so much better when we get a good night's sleep. And I believe that some of the other symptoms of post-traumatic stress that appear in the daytime when you're awake, avoidance, things that border on depression, can be helped by just providing an individual a good night's sleep. A good night's sleep, not only for the individual, but their partner, is critical. So I'm a big fan of wearables. I think they are going to help us not only when it comes to nightmares, but in many other areas. I think they're going to be particularly useful for the military population that is tired of being given a bag of pills and said, take these pills and you'll be fine. And almost every one of the prescriptions that's in that bag is an off-label. In fact, they all are off-label prescriptions for things that work with some people, but other people they don't.
It's like the joke that they would tell you, and they say, just take 2 Tylenol and drink a glass of water, you'll be okay. And the numbers on suicide, too, I mean, you mentioned some of them are just staggering. I mean, there was a report I was reading from the USO, put it out earlier this year, and I think it's September, that said that almost 31,000 active duty service members have died by suicide since 9/11, but we've lost just over 7,000 to combat. That's almost 4 times.
The numbers they're shocking. And the fact that we as a nation, we as a service haven't done what we did when COVID first hit. I use COVID as the perfect example of how things should work when it comes to development of treatments and vaccines. We went in 9 months from not really understanding what COVID was to having 3 vaccines that were highly effective. We did that, and I go back to my original theme, because of teamwork. Doctors realized this was a threat to every single one of us, and rather than work for individual accomplishment, they worked together as a team. You can read article after article about it. They broke the paradigm of how you do medical research. They worked together as a team to come up with those vaccines. Told each other when they went down a road that did not work, so that the other person did not, rather than hope that they would, so they would spend their capital, and time doing that. If we applied that same kind of research teamwork to getting at the problems of the brain, we'd be so much further along. It would be so much further along in many of the other diseases that plague mankind. I really believe the research ecosystem has to change. It should be a shock. We as a nation and as a world ought to be doing an after-action report. It says, how did we move in 9 months to 3 effective vaccines, and how could we apply some of those lessons learned to the way we do medical research across the board?
Well, I think you nailed a bit of it. I mean, this is better than almost the entire population, but this is a principle of war. Unity of command, unity of effort is one of the 9 principles of war that history shows, when you apply, actually gets it done.
When you were in Iraq and Afghanistan, at least I never entered a talk that didn't have a sign someplace that said, who else needs to know? And that's what we did. We made sure that everybody knew all those pieces of intel that were out there, so hopefully we could avoid catastrophe. In medical research, that's not necessarily how it works every single time. It worked, I believe, that way in developing the COVID vaccines. I just wish we'd do the same thing across the board, and particularly in the brain, because the brain is a really, really tough problem. And the fact that we've spent billions of dollars on post-traumatic stress research, and there's not a single drug that has come to market specifically for the treatment of post-traumatic stress, leads me to a conclusion that Einstein was right. If you continue doing things the same way time and time again and expect a different outcome, you're going to be disappointed.
You've talked about the DoD being pretty forward-leaning in respect to innovation and talking about these issues, bringing them to the forefront, investing money. But then you've also said the VA has lagged, and there's a gap. There's a big gap between DoD and VA. And even in the wearables, I think when you and I were speaking previously, you said that you look at wearables and DoD is saying, yeah, let's use them. VA is saying, no, we won't fund them. Can we close the gap? How do we do that?
I really wish that we would get leadership on both sides that realize the absolute importance of bringing the DoD and the VA together. One of the issues that I had was that, and a lot of this is based on regulation and policy. It's not that one organization is better than the other. But the DoD has a basic philosophy that anything that is approved by the FDA, they'll cover. If you're suffering from something in DoD and it has FDA approval, then go ahead and prescribe it. In order to save money on the VA side, they have a drug formulary. They have different formularies they use and different things that they apply. It's not necessarily because they're bad people. It's the way that the VA was set up by Congress. And this formulary, you have a kid who, let's take a drug, for example. If it's an off-label drug, when a kid finally finds the thing that works on him, that helps him get over whatever the symptom it is, leaves the service with his 90 days of whatever that drug is, and shows up at the VA on the other end and says, listen, I'm out of this particular drug that has really, really helped me with whatever it is I have. And the VA doctor looks at him and says, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to prescribe that because it's not on our formulary. It was a torturous journey to get to that right drug. He or she got the right drug, and now they're being told, as they have retired from the service, they can no longer get that drug. Many say, nope, I'm going to pay for it myself. I'll go out and find a doctor who will prescribe it to me, and I'll go ahead and pay for it myself, rather than take the substitute that the VA wants to give. It's those kinds of things that we just need to get rid of and understand that the individual is an individual from the time they join the service until they die. The systems should work together to ensure that journey, okay, is as similar as it is when you're on active duty as when you're seeking that same medical care and you're outside the service. We're able to get nightwear today covered for active component service members because of just what I talked about in DOD. We are not able to get it covered the VA, and I find that to be not a good thing.
Coming into a point in time in which we're not at war, we're not in declared conflict. Yes, we are at war, and we just may not know the enemy or what the new battlefield may bring exactly, but we're not in a declared combat zone. And we're not in a situation where the military is dominating the news cycle. And so what tends to happen, and I've had this conversation with various veteran service organizations and nonprofits, and I've said, guys, raising money was easy for 20 years because you turned on the news and the first thing everyone talked about was veteran-related issues and veterans and the military at war. It's not going to be like that now. As that ebbs and as that wanes and it goes away, raising awareness for these issues, we have to continue to do that or they'll become overcome by other events. So I think we owe it to all those that we led, all those we served with, to continue that conversation.
And we need leaders who come in. When I'm talking medical research, I'm a liberal arts major, okay? But I still get stuff addressed to me. I just came home from Thanksgiving holiday and I found something addressed to Dr. Chiarelli, and it offered me $250,000 if I signed it to plow into my practice. Well, I'm not a doctor. But I learned in studying medical research, there's two kinds of people. There's your MDs and there's your PhDs. And your PhDs are the ones that study and do the research, okay? And MDs, they see patients. And when you see patients, you want to help folks. What I was always attracted to as I got into this was MD PhDs. Those individuals who did research but also saw patients because their focus was on the patient. We need leadership in DOD and in the VA that isn't VA leadership and DOD leadership, but is focused on the service member from the time they enter the service until the time that we put them into the ground, when they pass. That's what we need. In that same kind of focus on the service member as an individual who lives a life. That's what has to happen. And when we get that kind of leader that's focused on the service member, not the individual organization, but the service member. DOD's the same. After almost 40 years of service, when I left, I was Mr. Chiarelli, okay? And now you're the VA's problem. You're no longer my problem.
I'm glad you brought up leadership because I cannot allow this conversation to end without pressing you. One of the greatest leaders we've had in the military. I have to press you on some leadership stuff. And I would argue that you may not have the paper that says it, but you certainly have an MD, PhD in leadership at all levels of command. But in March 2004, you were the division commander of the 1st Cavalry Division, an organization that, back in the frontier days, they rode horses, they wore Stetsons, they still wear Stetsons. They were the Huey helicopters in Vietnam and the air cavalry. And then they became an armored tank division. You spoke a little bit about your time leading a tank division or leading a tank organization and fielding the most advanced armored technology the world's ever seen. But this was also the definition of the Powell Doctrine that we talked about, air-land combat here. Yet you go to Baghdad in 2004 where you can't use tanks, you can't use heavy armor. It's a sprawling city of 8 million people. You have 20,000 soldiers under your command, and now you're in urban combat. And yet you weren't allowed to bring your tanks. The Pentagon said no. You understood it, didn't necessarily agree with it. When you looked at having to prepare your organization for going into Baghdad, for going into Iraq, the war's been going on a little bit under a year at this point, but it's so outside the realm of what you had trained for, what the division had trained for. When you think about your position there in that time as the leader of the organization, what went through your mind and what were you looking at to say, hey, we quickly have to adapt. We quickly have to iterate on what we're doing to give ourselves the best chance of being successful?
Again, I owe that to listening to somebody, and the person I listened to was Marty Dempsey. I was going to assume responsibility for Baghdad when I moved in, and he and the 1st Armored Division had it. I moved in and went on a 2-week reconnaissance and left seat, right seat ride with him about 4 months before we deployed, 4 or 5 months before we deployed. He pointed to things like Sadr City and said, we haven't had a single incident down there, but that doesn't mean it couldn't happen. He pointed to other areas in and around Baghdad that were tough areas. But he said, listen, really going to need to get ready to do is there's been a heck of a lot of money that's been given to us by Congress that's going to be used to try to rebuild the infrastructure here. You better get ready to execute some of those contracts. If I were you, I'd go back and learn everything I could about the 4 things that seem to be the most important over here to the Iraqis. Number 1 is electricity. Number 2 is sewage. Number 3 is potable water. And number 4 is one that I'd never thought of, getting your garbage picked up. You talk about a public health problem when you have sewage and garbage issues.
And these are all things we take for granted.
We take for granted. Marty said, go back and learn and make sure your soldiers know everything they can about that. Well, how do you do that with the heaviest division in the United States Army? And I talked to my leaders and I said, well, we got a big city near us, kind of not as big as Baghdad, but probably has some of those same issues. And we went down and spent a week in Austin, had support from the mayor. They talked us through all those essential services and what we needed to look for. They opened up a line that when we ran into issues that we could get on and do what we used to call video teleconferencing before Zoom, video teleconference with the folks in Austin.
It used to be a big deal. When they say you have a video teleconference, you're like nervous. Now we do it all day, every day.
Now we do it all day, every day. And I'll never forget the guy that really impressed me was the garbage guy. He basically said, garbage is respect for the customer. He expects you to come on whatever schedule you set. And once you set that schedule, you show up and you pick up his garbage. It's as simple as that, wherever it might be. And understand the culture. It's probably different in Baghdad than it is in Austin. And he was 100% right. By the time I spent my time in Baghdad, I knew more about sewers and how sewers operated, I think, than most engineers know about sewers and the different kinds of sewers that operated. But spending that time in Austin was absolutely fantastic, and it opened my leaders' eyes up to that. At the same time, I realized decisions to not bring our armor over because it portrayed the wrong kind of thing, like we were an invading force, to me was short-sighted. Let me bring it, let me park it, but make sure that it's available for me in the event that I needed it. And I will never forget, after the events of April 4th, when I was just taking over that sector from Marty Dempsey, the one question that I was asked in my 2 years in Iraq that I couldn't answer was a young E6 after we lost 8 and had over 60 individuals wounded in about a 4-hour period on April 4th of 2004, was a young E6 that said, sir, why didn't we bring our tanks? Why didn't we have our tanks? And I could not answer that question. Leadership is about listening. I listened to Marty. Not only did he tell me about the need to understand how basic services work, but at the same time, he told me, this is a dangerous place. And just because I haven't had anything happen in Sadr City in the year that I've been over here, or the 9 months that I've been over here, almost a year that I've been over here, doesn't mean that you won't. So be prepared for both.
The other parallel track in the establishment of basic services, which then led to job creation and improved quality of life for the Iraqis, was the counterinsurgency aspect of this, or the need that we as the U.S. could not become this occupier. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I was in a heavy mechanized infantry platoon in 4th Infantry Division, and that was a struggle we faced every day. Do we take the Humvees? Do we take the Bradleys? Well, we're getting hit. If we don't have the Bradleys, we're exposed. We don't have what we need to protect ourselves and fire back. But if we bring the Bradleys into the city, like now they see us as the occupying force. But at the end of the day, in the insurgency, in counterinsurgency, such a big part of it is training the host nation, training the locals to be able to assume their own responsibility, assume responsibility within the government, within the political aspects, within basic services, and within protection, internal police, and then also with the defense and with their military. When you went there, one of your big charges was, how do you empower now the Iraqi government, military, police to be able to start to solve their own problems? And how do they come together as Iraqis? Now, when we went to Iraq, there was we could argue, was there a sense of nationalism under Saddam? Was it forced nationalism? Will we ever really know? I don't know. But what we do know is that our entrance into there did create a Sunni Shia divide and led to some ethnic tensions. And it didn't help possibly that, we entered into de-Baathification, which then we disbanded all these essential services, and then we didn't allow those people to actually take control and be in charge. When you think about that, and you think about now you're here, you have to get these people to come back together. You have to get your team to work with them. The only way you're going to do this is through this teamwork, this unity of effort without being seen as this occupier. How do you think through that complexity?
It's all about team building and listening to your folks and going back to some of those lessons that you learned growing up. I always tell young leaders, remember the things that really, really upset you. I remember an Army 3-star general who growing up never understood why you had to go ahead and, clean your quarters, have an inspection by a bureaucrat that came over with the white gloves and the whole 9 yards and failed you the first time and made you and your wife do it again, or hire an outside cleaning team to come and do it, and you'd finally get the paperwork signed off on. You'd roll out of your driveway just as the truck was coming in to go ahead and paint your place. Why did you go through all that cleaning if you're going to have a whole bunch of painters who are working for minimum wage come in and paint that same place? And he changed that when he got himself in a position where he could change that. And that's one of the things that I remembered from my youth as an armored cavalry company commander who was always chopped to a different unit, that it was absolutely critical that you had a feeling of belonging to that particular unit. So when it came time to train the Iraqi soldiers, I drew back on that lesson learned and said, you know what, rather than set up individual units that go around and train Iraqis, the Iraqi military, and work in the operational area of one of my brigades, creating all the friction that creates, I'm going to make that a brigade responsibility to apply the resources it needs to train the Iraqis within their operational area, which should take away some of that friction and make the trainers feel that they are part of the unit. We got that right, I believe, in the 1st Cavalry Division. I think subsequently, with the creation of outside teams that came in, rather than making it an operational requirement to train the Iraqis within your particular sector, was a lesson that we should have learned worked. Instead, we applied a different model that I think created some of the issues that we had.
Sir, you're an optimist like me, and I read about you and I did the research. I read the 4th Star book that highlights you and General Petraeus and General Casey and General Abizaid. And I think so much along the same lines that you do, and that if you believe people are good and you believe that inherently they want to do the right thing, if you give them the right tools, that they're going to drive themselves to be successful, they're going to do it at all costs, they're not going to let you down. But I feel like that mindset, it builds great teams, it builds great organizations, but we're also so prone to being let down. We're so prone to disappointment when we look at others and we say, oh man, I expected so much. I expected you to do this. When you were looking back on Iraq and as you transitioned into the vice chief role, and we've got into 2008, 2009, And we started having this feeling about, did we want this more than the Iraqis wanted it? Were we more committed than they were? How do you continue to motivate the force? And I ask you this question because in a lot of ways, where we sit now, we're at the end of the global war on terror. Officially, it's over. We're moving on to the next thing. We have to reconcile where we were, what we did over the last 20 years. You lost 168 soldiers as the division commander during a difficult time in Iraq. But when you look back on that and you think about where do we go from here, how do you sum up the 20 years of the global war on terror?
Yeah, it wasn't a whole of government effort. That's how I sum it up. If you leave it up to me, the problem with us and problem with guys like me is if you give me a mission, I'm going to do everything I possibly can to get it done. And if you don't give me all the resources I need, I'm going to look elsewhere to find those resources or figure out a way to do the job without having them. If you go back, and I'm a student of history, I know it's hard to make comparisons between what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan in World War II, but in World War II, it was a whole of government effort. It was everybody contributed. And quite frankly, that's not what we have seen over the last 20 years. And we in the military have a belief that we can solve just about any problem. But the fact of the matter is, I think you get what you get when you leave it up to us without bringing the whole of government to bear and all the power of government. And that power not only resides in its military, it resides in a whole bunch of other things. I remember they've been fighting and doing so many things in Iraq for so long that their farmers had forgot how to farm in the areas they were. And I remember early on in my first tour as division commander, I asked to get some agronomists over from universities, and they were more than willing to come. They went into these very difficult places all the time as what they were doing as university agronomists and help people in very dangerous places, and they were willing to come. But I couldn't get clearance from the United States government to bring these folks in. For many of these colleges, it could have been tremendously helpful to providing the Iraqis something that they really needed. And I think that's one example of a whole bunch that I could give you that shows that we did not fight these wars with a whole of government approach. And had we done that, I think you would have seen a totally different outcome. What I learned the most in training the Iraqi military, I can train anybody to fight. But if there's not a government behind them that is going to do the kinds of things that our government does for our servicemen and women, okay, they are not going to be the effective fighting force that we are. That is so important to understand. I believe, and this may sound self-serving because I'm a military guy, I did a great job training armies in both countries. What we did was a poor job of creating governments who could support those armies when it came time for us to leave. And that, to me, is the failure. And had we done that, had we brought a whole of government approach to that, I think we would have had a totally different outcome than we did in probably a much shorter time period than the 20 years it took us to reach the positions that we did.
Well, we saw that at the exit, I won't call it a drawdown, but the exit of Afghanistan. A lot of people are asking, well, how did 20 years go away in 6 days? And it really what it came down to was the logistics. We pulled the logistics, and we had not invested enough in their ability to maintain the logistics. And then that, certainly there are a lot of other factors and a simplistic view of it, but that precipitated and accelerated, and it is used as an example here, to show that if we don't invest in the totality of everything, simply training folks to fight can't stand.
And the other issue that I always talk to folks about is force caps. We ask a commander to tell you how many folks is he going to need in order to accomplish the mission he's asked. And if it falls outside a number that we just don't want to support, we place a force cap on it. I can go time after time after time after time. I will never forget a story that Bob Gates told me when they were getting ready to go in the Gulf. Colin Powell was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Norman Schwarzkopf came to him after he had done his evaluation what he was going to need to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. And Norman came and said, I'm going to need a corps out of Europe. Powell looked at him and said, are you sure? He said, no, I'm going to need a corps out of Europe. He said, are you ready to tell the president that and explain that to the president? Schwarzkopf said, I am. And they went to Kennebunkport, and Bob Gates says, I'll never forget, Norman Schwarzkopf came into the room. The president asked him for his evaluation. He said, I'm going to need all these forces out of Europe in order to do this. And the president looked at him and said, are you sure that you're going to need all those? And he said, yes, Mr. President, I'm sure. And President Bush said, approved, and walked out of the room. We lost that in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I don't need to recount for you the number of times decisions were made on force caps. And I don't think the American people understand that you had force caps on uniformed personnel, but you did not have force caps on contractors. I remember the statistic that still shocks me in Iraq is when I left Iraq the first time in 2005, there were 2 contractors for every soldier that was stationed over there. I think there's a lot of lessons learned that we need to pull out of this whole thing, but it comes down to, if you want a bumper sticker to place on it, don't enter into a conflict, don't enter into a war if you don't have a whole of government effort and are able and ready to apply all the powers, both kinetic and non-kinetic, that the government has in order to meet a well-defined objective.
You teed up my next quote perfectly, and it comes from the Fourth Star. And the authors, David Cloud and Greg Jaff, say, generals didn't get to pick the wars they were asked to win. There was no guarantee that a future White House wouldn't send the Army into another misbegotten conflict, or that a crisis wouldn't emerge requiring a large conventional ground force. The Army had to be ready for a whole range of contingencies, as Iraq had shown. Chiarelli wasn't sure he could predict what the next war would look like, but he knew what kind of officers would be needed. He wanted an officer corps that argued, debated, and took intellectual risks. So as you look forward, we have this term hybrid warfare. What do you see the next battlefield looking like?
I see that quote to be much more important today than it was when I uttered it. We need that same kind of leader. The leader is able to take intellectual risk, debate, and make sure that you're applying that you've garnered over a career to whatever that problem is. We need lifelong learners who are able to understand. We need some other things. We need to reform our acquisition system so it doesn't take a statement of a requirement to put something in the hands of the soldiers, 12 to 14 years to do that. There are other things that we need to do. We need to break some of the molds that have guided us in the past. But more than anything, we need leaders exactly like are described in that quote. I believe that with all my heart, because we can't predict the future. We don't know what's going to happen.
Sir, as we close out, I ask every guest the 3 things that they do every day to be successful, and I quantify it in terms of the Jedburghs in World War II had to do 3 things as core foundational tasks. They had to be able to shoot, they had to be able to move, they had to be able to communicate. If they did these 3 things with the utmost proficiency every day, they could apply their focus to other challenges that came their way. What are the 3 things that you do every day to be successful?
First, I do what one of my heroes told a graduating class to do. The very first thing I do is make my bed. Bill McRaven said that in a very famous speech. Admiral Bill McRaven, that's an important task. If you do that every day, and granted, sometimes my wife's in bed a little longer than I am, and she makes it, but if I'm alone, I make my bed every day. The second thing I try to do is to put aside at least 60 minutes a day to read, and I like to take myself outside of my comfort zone. I will read a medical paper on a particular protein that's associated with traumatic brain injury in individuals. I will read out of my comfort zone for a liberal arts guy in some things that are only done by engineers. But I always try to put together 60 minutes to do that. And then because I can't stop working and I've got different teams doing different things, how can my team better? How can I create an environment that is going to allow them to reach their full potential? Because when we reach it together, we will solve the tough issues that we're trying to solve. I stay engaged, keep my mind going, and building those teams in whatever I'm doing is absolutely critical to me. And those are the 3 things that occupy my day every single day.
Make your bed, dedicate 60 minutes or some time to read outside of your comfort zone to further develop yourself and develop the team, invest in the team, and find a way to drive them to their maximum potential. So we talked about the 9 characteristics of elite performance as defined by special operations, the driving force here: drive, resiliency, adaptability, humility, integrity, curiosity, team ability, effective intelligence, and emotional strength. And at the end of every episode, I take 1 or 2 of them, and sometimes I've taken all of them and I've applied them to my guests and what I think they characterize and show us every single day. Teamwork, I certainly believe, is one of your strong suits. We've spoken a lot, but I also think curiosity is a big one. The challenge of the status quo, the continuous learner, the development of yourself and those around you to find innovative ways to solve complex challenges. You've demonstrated this in your career from your first days as an ROTC cadet all the way through the leader of the Army, one of the most successful leaders that our military and our nation has ever seen. You're an eternal optimist. You see the good in people, you value their hard work, you push them to be the best versions of themselves, and you set the example for the rest of us to follow. I thank you so much for your service. I thank you so much for joining me today. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with you in the future as we continue to advocate for leaders, for PTS, TBI, and all of the factors and all the things that are veterans out there today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, sir. It's been wonderful talking with you.
American Jedburghs went on to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh Podcast. I'm your host, Fran Racioppi. We're brought to you by the Talent War Group, an executive search firm and talent advisory. We'll drive you to attract, retain, and develop top talent. With services like talent acquisition, leadership development, and keynote speeches, we work with you to create talent solutions to business problems. To get started, visit talentwargroup.com. Join us next week for a new episode of the Jedburgh Podcast on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, the Talent War Group, and the Jedburgh Podcast on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and send your comments and inquiries to media@talentwargroup.com. As former members of Special Operations Forces, the Jedburgh Podcast and the Talent War Group contribute a percentage of all profits to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, supporting the families of our fallen warriors. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.